Autumn 1861, central London. Picture a 19-year-old girl named Matilda Shore. She suddenly starts vomiting this thin, green liquid. Her fingernails? They turn green. The whites of her eyes? Completely green. She even tells her doctor that literally everything she looks at has a green tint to it. And within days, she's dead, convulsing and foaming from the mouth, nose, and eyes. Now here's the crazy part. Matilda wasn't poisoned by some enemy. She was poisoned by her job, working with green arsenic dye. But what's truly terrifying here is that Matilda's gruesome death, well, it's just the endpoint of a staggering 6,000-year historical pattern. Welcome to this explainer on the deadly history of toxic beauty. For millennia, people kept painting their faces with lead, mercury, and arsenic, even though doctors literally warned them in writing about the dangers. So why do it? Well, because in a world where your beauty determined who you married, what you inherited, and honestly, whether you survived, slow poisoning was actually kind of a rational choice. Today, we're unpacking this fatal societal trap, where the most desired beauty products on Earth were, shockingly, the exact same substances as the deadliest poisons.
Section 1. Ancient Origins of Toxic Beauty, when makeup was medicine.
To really wrap our heads around how this happened, we've got to go all the way back to Egypt around 4000 BCE. So back then, this thick black eyeliner called kohl was used by everyone. We're talking kings, pyramid builders, men, women, kids, you name it. It was made from galena, which is lead sulfide, ground into a powder, and the whole point was to protect against the glaring sun and disease down in the swampy Nile floodplains. But here's where it gets wild. In 2010, the Louvre made this insane discovery about Egyptian kohl chemistry. They found compounds in this ancient kohl that literally do not exist in nature. It turns out the Egyptians were taking lead oxide and soaking it in salt water for up to 40 days to create these chemicals. Think about that for a second. Around 2000 BCE, Egyptian makeup artists were essentially the world's first chemists. They synthesized an engineered antibiotic that boosted immune cells a full 2,000 years before anyone even had a concept of what a germ was. But, as you might guess, that incredible medical purpose? Yeah, it didn't last. The Greeks inherited Egyptian cosmetics, but entirely stripped away the medicine, leaving just the poison. See, the new beauty ideal demanded pale, chalky white skin. It was the ultimate flex to prove a woman was wealthy enough to stay indoors all day. To get that look, they slathered on highly corrosive synthetic white lead. Fast forward to Rome, and they're taking things a step further by putting drops from the deadly nightshade plant directly into their eyes. Why? To chemically fake sexual arousal by forcing their pupils to dilate. The pharmacological cost was absolutely brutal. We were talking lead colic, rotting teeth, racing heartbeats, and permanent blindness. Women were literally trading their eyesight just to look turned on. And honestly, this brings up the staggering hypocrisy of the whole era. Back in the 4th century BCE, Plato actually called cosmetics a mischievous, deceitful, mean, and ignoble practice. It's incredible, right? This whole intellectual argument that makeup equals deception was essentially built by men to control their wives. They demanded women look perfectly pale to prove their high social status, sold them the literal poison to achieve it, and then turned around and mocked them as deceitful for actually using the stuff. And women, they kept using the lead because nobody was offering them a world where being beautiful didn't matter. Section 2. Medieval Sin and Renaissance Lead. The Devil's Gateway. So when medieval Europe rises to power, the church steps in with a completely different objection. Leaders like Tertullian stopped calling makeup a dangerous poison and just started calling it straight up demonic. He actually told women who painted their faces, "You are the devil's gateway." But then the theologian Thomas Aquinas comes along and creates this absolutely devastating double bind. He ruled that a married woman must be beautiful to please her husband. Totally acceptable, it was her duty. But if a woman wanted to be beautiful just for herself, well, that was the mortal sin of pride. So women were essentially trapped. They were forced to keep painting their faces with toxic chemicals to appease their demanding husbands, all while living under this constant, looming threat of spiritual damnation. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and Venice becomes the undisputed cosmetics capital of the world, churning out this premium product called Venetian ceruse. And man, this stuff created a tragic, vicious biological cycle. Step 1. The lead and vinegar mixture strips away natural oils and completely damages the skin. Step 2. Women, and we're talking even 6-year-old girls here, had to apply even more lead just to cover up those new scars. Step 3. To fix that terrible damage, they'd resort to a corrosive mercury skin peel. And step 4. The horrific finale. Hair loss, blackened teeth, and ultimately total organ failure. Now, surrounded by all these poisons right on their dressing tables, and stuck in a society where getting a divorce from an abusive husband was legally impossible, an underground network of women figured out a pretty deadly business model. They created something called aqua tofana. What was it? Basically, arsenic trioxide perfectly disguised as a Catholic devotional oil dedicated to St. Nicholas. The genius of it was that it was completely untraceable. A woman could just leave it sitting right out in the open on her vanity. Then, over weeks or even months, she could slip small doses to a violent husband. It perfectly mimicked a natural illness. This gave him time to confess his sins so his soul went to heaven, all while 600 women from inescapable nightmare marriages. Section 3. Elizabeth and the Ceruse Mask. A face as a state secret. While those Italian women used cosmetic poisons to escape powerlessness, Queen Elizabeth I used them to project absolute, unquestionable authority. After surviving a really bad, scarring bout of smallpox in 1562, her face essentially became a state secret. She had it heavily painted with that exact same deadly Venetian ceruse we just talked about, using it to project this ageless porcelain mask of political stability. Now, as a political performance, it worked flawlessly. But the physical cost was just brutal. By her mid-60s, eyewitnesses described her as having severe hair loss and entirely black teeth. The skin on her face was actively eroding under layers of toxic lead that were reportedly half an inch thick. Toward the end of her life, she fell into this unshakable, deep melancholy. Her body was so swollen that her coronation ring literally had to be filed off her finger. And the most tragic detail? When someone finally brought her a true mirror 20 years, she screamed in rage. She was quite literally poisoned by the very makeup she needed to survive as queen. Section 4. The Victorian Arsenic Craze. Dying looked beautiful. As we jump forward into the Georgian and Victorian eras, the aesthetic shifts to this highly romanticized tuberculosis look. But make no mistake, the poison is still very much there. Suddenly, emaciation, pale skin, flushed cheeks, and dilated eyes were the ultimate aspiration. Now I want you to focus on the number 27. That is the age Maria Gunning was when she died. She was this famous 18th century Irish beauty whose husband was incredibly controlling. He actually once chased her around a dinner table in public and scrubbed right off her face with a napkin. But she just couldn't stop using it. Modern medicine suggests she ultimately died of tuberculosis that was made catastrophically worse by chronic lead poisoning. And the truly tragic twist here, her husband's mistress died 7 years later from the exact same combination at just 25 years old. He literally watched white lead kill them both. And, incredibly, by the late 1800s, this poison was being sold completely openly, right over the counter. I mean, look at this advertising copy for Dr. Mackenzie's Improved Harmless Arsenic Wafers from 1893. It promised that one box will produce the most lovely complexion that the imagination could desire. Let that sink in. Harmless arsenic. These wafers worked by literally destroying the user's red blood cells to create that pale, sickly look. But here is the cruelest irony of the whole arsenic craze. Women who chronically ingested these wafers eventually developed a diffuse, permanent darkening of the skin, which is of course the exact opposite of what they were paying for. Section 5. Radium and the First Regulations. The Glowing Fountain of Youth. You might be thinking, okay, surely entering the 20th century would finally end this madness, right? Actually, no. When Marie and Pierre Curie isolated radium, the beauty industry instantly jumped on it, promising a literal glowing fountain of youth. But the real horror story wasn't found in the expensive face creams, it was in the factories. The instructions given to young women who were painting glow-in-the-dark clock dials were chillingly simple. Lip, dip, paint. They were told to use their mouths to give the radium-laced brushes a fine, sharp tip. A 24-year-old dial painter named Molly Maggia did this hundreds of times a single day. And here's the biological nightmare. Radium mimics calcium, so it deposits directly into your bones and completely shatters your DNA. By 1922, Molly's jaw had literally crumbled. It was lifted out entirely, just resting in her dentist's hands right before she died. Molly's horrific death, along with so many others, finally sparked a revolution. In 1927, the famous Radium Girls sued their employers, which established our foundational industrial disease laws. But believe it or not, the cosmetics industry still fought back tooth and nail. It wasn't until 1933 when the FDA toured this shocking exhibit called the American Chamber of Horrors. It showed gruesome photographs of women who had been blinded and disfigured by unregulated makeup. At that point, the public had finally had enough. So, in 1988, Congress passed the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Think about that timeline. It took 6,000 years for a government to actually mandate that beauty products needed to be safe. Section 6. The Modern Toxic Legacy. the cycle continues. So, the story ends happily in 1938, right? Well, not exactly. Because despite those hard-won regulations, toxic elements have proven incredibly difficult to completely eliminate from our lives. For instance, lead acetate. It remained a fully permitted, perfectly legal ingredient in American hair dye until the FDA formally revoked its approval as recently as 2018. 2018! And if you think it's just hair dye, prepare yourself for a modern gut punch. In 2010, the FDA ran tests on 20 incredibly popular name-brand lipsticks. The results? 100% of them contained detectable lead. 0% were lead-free. The highest reading was 7.19 parts per million of lead, sitting right there in a single tube of pink lipstick. Now, it's absolutely vital to understand here that safe, natural alternatives, they have always existed. We've had Galen's cold cream straight from ancient Rome, which, by the way, is essentially just modern moisturizer made of beeswax, olive oil, and rose water. People had henna, crushed berries, beetroot, almond oil, and rice powder. The technology to make yourself beautiful without literally poisoning yourself was available in every single era we've just covered. But the problem? Those natural options were never dramatic, luminous, or expensive enough to satisfy the extreme beauty standards demanded by society and by... Ultimately, the market for poison existed because poison signaled wealth. Which really leaves us with a final, unsettling thought to chew on. Are we truly free from this 6,000-year vicious cycle of toxic beauty? Think about it. A 19-year-old girl in 1861 dying with green eyes. A queen whose face eroded beneath heavy lead. A factory worker whose jaw literally crumbled. And 2010 laboratory tests showing lead in everyday cosmetics. The exact same chemistry that killed queens and factory girls centuries ago is still, right now, in trace amounts sitting on our lips today. The story of toxic beauty, it seems, is still being written. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you in the next one.